unnecessary destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli, and it is now time for, yes, the Thursday night edition of the Gaggle live stream. Thank you very much, everybody who joined me. Had some issues with the lighting. I think the lighting isn't so great. Let me. All right, I'm trying. Okay, let me. Okay, that's all right. Yeah. Okay. So thank you everybody who has joined me. And there are a few things that I want to get out of the way. And as you probably know, during the last couple of days, Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, was in the United States, and he was there, to encourage President Trump, and as he happens with him, encourage him, butter him up, and sing the glories of NATO and how much everybody's doing for NATO and how everybody's putting their shoulders to the wheel for NATO. But in doing what he did, Rutte kind of blurted out a lot of the things that NATO really doesn't want disclosed. For example, the extent of the NATO involvement in the attacks on Iran. Now Rutte did this in order to reassure, apparently, Americans, and obviously President Trump, that the Europeans are not really freeloaders, but on the contrary, they're absolutely stalwart fighters for Western civilization and want to get their hands on Iran and destroy Iran's nuclear capability and so on. But as he spoke, it became clear that NATO was really much more heavily involved than we had been led to believe. Just as NATO insists that it is not a party to the conflict, so the party to the Ukraine conflict. So we have the claims that, well, of course, NATO had nothing to do with Iran, but as disclosed by Rutte, NATO was quite involved. So let's just watch, first of all, Rutte being interviewed by Brett Baer of Fox News, and watch what he says.
Back on the program. As you get ready for this meeting, you've heard the president pretty pointed in some of his remarks. What's your thoughts, and what are you hoping to accomplish? Well, first of all, on Iran as such, let me just say that I think the president is doing exactly what is needed. Degrading Iran's nuclear capability. Could you imagine if Iran would get its hands on the nuclear weapon? This is an exporter of chaos. It is an exporter of terrorism. It would be devastating for the region. It would be devastating for the whole world. And if that moment would come where they would get their hands on that nuclear weapon, and it's too late. We have seen it with North Korea. So I think the president is doing exactly what is necessary. I completely behind him on this. But when it comes to NATO, I know there is disappointment. But let's also see these are isolated cases, because there is something more to say about this. Country after country, ally after ally after ally have made their bases available for Epic Fury. It means thousands, between 4,000 and 5,000 sorties. So planes taking off from European bases to support Epic Fury, and therefore Europe being this let's say, platform of power projection for the United States. So there's more to this than the isolated cases, and sometimes that gets a bit lost now, I think, in the discussion. I guess the president focuses on some of those isolated cases. Reuters had Not Our War. This is back in March. The German defense minister, Boris Pistorius, was just as direct as his boss, Chancellor Merz. This is not our war. We have not started it. Echoing Germany's stance, French President Emmanuel Macron also said, we are not party to the conflict. In Spain, Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez was quick to denounce the attacks on Iran as reckless and illegal and brushed off threats from Trump to cut trade with Spain if it did not allow jointly operated bases to be used for the war. This is a Reuters write-up, but you add to that the Italian Prime Minister, who has now had a back and forth about the use of bases in Italy. So the president, I think, is pointing to that, right? I think so, yes, you're right. And I totally understand the disappointment. But when you take, for example, Italy, 500 US planes took off from US bases in Italy to support Epic Fury. So,
all right, let's start. So 500 US planes took off from Italy, from U.S. air bases in Italy. 500 planes took off in order to take part in Operation Epic Fury. So that's quite a contribution. Remember, the story that they're putting out, these Europeans are putting out, that this, exactly as Brad Bear said, well, it's not our war, this has nothing to do with us. This is Trump. This is the United States. Now he's saying 500 U.S. aircraft took off from Italy to take part in Operation Epic Fury. This is completely contrary to anything Giorgia Meloni said. Remember, Meloni had been putting forward that, we have our agreement with the United States, and these agreements are very, very limited, and they only concern issues of the Italian defense. They don't involve conflict outside our zone of responsibility. They don't involve conflict outside of NATO. That's what Meloni was saying. She made a big song and dance about this. That somehow, we're not giving permission to the United States, and hey, it's just that's the NATO Secretary General who just said this. All right, let's listen a little bit more to Mark Rutte.
This is massive. When you look at the whole of Europe, again, it's between 4,000 and 5,000. A country like Romania, its capital, Bucharest, they had to cut down on commercial air flights and airplanes because they had to use the airport for the tanker facility. So all this is taking place.
Okay, so that's Romania. Yet another non-participant in the conflict who said they had to cut down close down the airports in Bucharest because they were so heavily involved in supporting the U.S. operation. Nice of Rutte to reveal this. The stuff about Meloni is, I think, the most shocking. I mean, we don't expect much from Romania, but Meloni, who had made such a big issue out of this, that she was standing up to Trump, and he's saying, no, 500 aircraft took off from Italy. All right, let's listen a little more to Rutte.
But what I will do tomorrow in my discussion with the president is not only discuss this, we will also zoom out from this to this bigger picture of what he is doing for NATO. When you look at the numbers of the investments NATO countries are now making in their own defense, it is staggering. I cannot give you everything tonight because I have to keep something for till tomorrow and for the media tomorrow, but it is...
All right, so that was the lead up from Rutte. So this is Rutte the night before his meeting in the Oval Office with Trump. And the meeting with Trump was very interesting. Trump was really generally very ill-humored. Seemed, seemed in a really bad mood through most of it. But nonetheless, he, as usual, seems to like Rutte, but doesn't seem to like any of the other Europeans. So as he listened to Rutte's presentation, you can see him scowling, looking around, looking at the floor, just he was bored. Um, but clearly, Rutte's job is, he wants to keep the show on the road, and remember, there's going to be a big NATO summit in early July in Ankara, and Trump has now promised to show up at the summit. And during this news conference, he said that the only reason, he said the only reason he's showing up, he said, is he likes Erdogan. He said, "Oh, Erdogan asked me to show up. I'm going to do this as a favor for Erdogan. If it hadn't been for Erdogan, I wouldn't have shown up." And then Rutte says, "But you would have shown up for me, wouldn't you?" In a kind of jocular way. And then Trump says, "Yeah, I would have shown up for you, but for no one else." But anyway, it was a strange kind of love fest between Rutte and Trump. So let's just watch a little bit.
A few things, but let me, and I know that.
Let me just watch. Let's watch a little bit of the Rutte Trump face-off in the Oval Office, which was yesterday. So.
About the let's say your irritation about that, but when you look at the numbers, 4,000 to 5,000 U.S. planes taking off from bases in Europe in the 6 weeks this war took place. Still, the ceasefire took place mid-April. In Bucharest, the airport in Romania, having to close. It had to close for commercial traffic, and because they had to make sure that you were able to send a tanker aircraft up in the air. So this is what I know. There have been isolated cases about which you are really disappointed. But generally speaking, your European allies have been there with you. I really want to make the point. 4,000 to 5,000 US planes taking off from European air bases. So that's about Iran. Now I want to take you, if you stay here, I go over to these boards here, because I want to show you what this president was able to achieve. And I start with this chart. This chart is about the Trump trillion. The Trump trillion shows you the increase.
All right, so this was Rutte being kind of rather amusing, pointing to all these charts and these all kinds of columns, making it all like a big CEO at some corporate shindig presentation. Here I've got all my PowerPoint slides, and everybody now. You can see how prepared I am for this and everything. So, he talked a little bit like this, and then Trump got onto two other interesting things. He first of all about the Europeans, and then he said something about Zelensky, which I want to get onto in a little later in this live stream. So first of all, here is Trump, on the Europeans. And so this is around.
With NATO treaties.
Well, let me just say, he's been a friend of mine. He's a great guy, great leader, great Secretary General. Everybody respects him. And I appreciate your nice words, but you really have done a good job. And I think if anybody else were in that position, we wouldn't even be meeting today, to be honest with you, because we were let down. We didn't need help on this at all. We demolished them in literally the first week. But it would have been nice if they would have said, we'd like to help. We didn't even need it, but it would have been nice if they said that. They didn't say it. But as Secretary General, and he's the boss of the whole operation, he was, I believe if I would have called him, and I didn't bother doing that because I was doing individual countries just to take the temperature and see how they were doing. But I think if I would have called him, he probably would have found a way to help if we needed it. I feel, would have been a little bit different. But I was disappointed. I was disappointed with Italy. I was disappointed with the UK. He's now gone. And, he had a lot of problems. But we were disappointed with the UK. We were disappointed with Germany and France. We were disappointed with most of them. Spain is a horror show. Spain is terrible, even from your standpoint. I mean, they don't want to pay anything. They think they're in for a free ride. Spain is not a good group. Not a good group at all. But I have great respect for this man. And so we're going to be discussing what took place, and we'll see what happens. Thank you.
Can I answer to your second question? Because I don't have many disagreements with the President of the United States. Here I have slightly, because I do agree there's reason for disappointment, absolutely. But my argument is this. These are isolated cases. When you look at the overall, take for example Germany. From day one, they delivered on their these are bilateral commitments, a bit of the techniques of this, but the technology, but these are bilateral commitments these countries are having with the United States. So this is not, strictly speaking, NATO. Bilateral commitments, they all did what they promised to do. And this led to between 4,000 and 5,000 US planes taking off from Europe. I would argue it would have been very difficult to do Iran without having Europe as a power projection platform for the United States. Delivered again, he's right. There is also reason for disappointment. It is a mixed bag.
All right. So you can see what Rutte is trying to do. He's the Secretary General of this organization, most of whose members are absolutely off their rocker, filled with this absolute rage and hysteria about Russia and seeking to provoke a war with Russia that will be fought on their behalf by the United States. That's pretty much the sum and substance of the NATO membership. So he has to represent them because Iran just didn't interest them. The Middle East just doesn't really interest them. I mean, they're just obsessive about Russia. And they obviously don't like Trump. They don't like being bullied by Trump. They don't like being bullied by the United States. They don't like being told they got to spend more on their military, which they don't have that money, and they don't really want. They don't have the guts to take any serious decisions about their future, about their economic decline, about their deindustrialization, and of course, later on in this news conference, we don't have time to watch this, but later on, Trump returns to a familiar theme when it comes to the UK, when he said, you remember that truth that he sent out when predicting that Keir Starmer will be resigning soon. He said, well, he made two serious blunders. It says one was immigration, and the second was energy. And the energy part was very interesting because here Trump is onto something that's very, very important, namely that Britain really has no need to be so impoverished, and particularly impoverished when it comes to energy. Britain has, unlike most other countries in Europe, Britain has a big source of energy, North Sea oil. But due to all sorts of environmental preoccupations, preoccupations about greenhouse gases, fossil fuels, windmills and solar panels and all the rest, basically Britain hasn't been investing in the North Sea oil in many years. It's harder and harder for the big oil giants to gain licenses to drill for oil in the North Sea. And essentially, it's an untapped resource. And so for Britain to go around whining about energy costs when it's actually sitting on a huge source of energy, I mean, is pathetic. And I think Trump has been right to point out, hey, you've got a lot of energy there. Make use of it. But the British government, and it's not just Labour, this has been true of all the Tories as well, they haven't invested in North Sea oil the way they used to back in the 1970s and 80s. And that's not because the oil is running out. There's plenty of oil in the North Sea. Look at Norway. Norway gets a lot of its oil from the North Sea. Norway invests in it. Norway is one of the richest countries in the world. But Britain hasn't done so. I mean, you remember Boris Johnson, remember his Build Back Greener and all this nonsense. When he was a Tory. So that Trump rightly brought that up, and again, rightly to suggest that the Europeans were a particularly pathetic bunch. But Rutte wants to keep the whole NATO show on the road. He doesn't want these rifts. He wants everybody to go to Ankara and not get into these fights. Now, what's interesting here, and I think this is the topic really I want to spend some time discussing, is that while Trump is pissed off with the lack of support that he has received from the Europeans on Iran and the Persian Gulf, and trying to break the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, he does seem to be. Now, we always have to be cautious whenever we make predictions about Trump. He does seem to be moving in the direction of the Europeans on Ukraine. Now, the Europeans, of course, as I said, they're absolutely committed, obsessively committed to the cause of Ukraine. And they have cobbled together this, essentially a fantasy, that Ukraine is winning this war. Now, as you know, I've always been skeptical of those who claim that, Russia's winning this war, Russia's marching to victory, because I've always thought that's wildly overstated. But that doesn't mean that the opposite is true, and that Ukraine is winning this war and Ukraine is marching to victory. That certainly isn't true. And there's no evidence for it. But this is a case of how you manufacture consensus. You manufacture a consensus on the state of the war, and so everyone then repeats it. Boom, 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 boom. Everyone on Twitter, on Facebook, everyone repeats the same line. Ukraine is doing fantastically. Russia is collapsing. No real evidence is presented for this. But once you gain traction with that, then you reach the conclusion that, well, if Ukraine is winning this war, shouldn't we start putting a lot more weaponry, sending a lot more to Ukraine, and imposing ever harsher sanctions on Russia, and seizing their oil tankers, the so-called shadow fleet, so that'll put additional pressure on Russia and force Putin to the negotiating table. I mean, that's the story. Now, Trump had sort of blown hot and cold, really, on the issue of Ukraine. As you know, he came into office promising to bring the war to an end, really, within 24 hours, even before taking the oath of office. And then, soon after he took office, he initiated a certain flurry of diplomacy. So you recall there were telephone calls between Trump and Putin. And then there was, of course, the meeting between Rubio and Lavrov in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, and and it seemed as if there was some interest in some diplomatic resolution of this war. Now, the Europeans hated this, absolutely hated this idea, and started making ridiculous demands, such as, well, fine, yeah, let's have an immediate, unconditional ceasefire. And of course, Russia said no. I mean, why should we give you an immediate unconditional ceasefire? And so that you'll be able to use the time in order to replenish Ukraine's destroyed weaponry and allow the Ukrainian armed forces to take a breather, redeploy, and then get ready for the next round of fighting in about a year or two. So obviously Russia said no, and there's absolutely no necessity for there to be a ceasefire as a condition of any negotiations. But nonetheless, the Europeans moved in on this and said, "Oh yeah, let's have an immediate and unconditional ceasefire." Trump seemed to embrace that, but he also didn't embrace it. And then, of course, there was the meeting in Anchorage. And I'm going to come on to that. What the various interpretations of Anchorage have been, but nonetheless, for a while, it seemed as if Trump was interested in bringing the war to an end. Now, I was always a little skeptical just how interested he really was in this, because the United States wasn't losing anything by continuing with the war. The only possible loss for the United States was the possible escalation and the dangerous situation that might arise between the United States and Russia. The United States really doesn't want to get into a shooting war with Russia. It's much rather just keep this war at the level that's going right now. Obviously, Russians are losing lives at a quite a horrific rate. Ukrainians are losing lives, but the U.S. military industry is doing pretty well, and there's no particular pressure on the United States to bring it to an end. I mean, there's only pressure if the United States is suffering casualties or if the United States is suffering economically, as there was in the case of Iran. So then Trump realized, I need to bring this to an end. But there's no comparable pressure on him with Ukraine. And to be honest, he essentially seems to have lost interest in Ukraine. You just can't get him interested in the subject. He seemed very interested during the campaign. He seemed interested in the early days of the administration, but he's not that interested now. The Europeans, on the other hand, are very, very interested in this. And that's why they think they've now managed to corral Trump on their side. Trump is now playing on the Europeans' team. But anyway, during this, first of all, during this news conference with Rutte, Trump was asked about what did he think of Zelensky, because, recall, Trump really didn't like Zelensky. I don't think he liked Zelensky at all. But there was that ugly confrontation in the Oval Office. It was February 2025, when he's saying, hey, you don't have any cards, you're losing, and so on. So here he was asked, let's see this, about whether does he still think Zelensky is a loser.
President Zelensky is winning right now. He famously.
Well, he's doing pretty well. Look, no matter how you
First of
look
all,
at it, he's doing pretty-
notice here the question says Zelensky is doing well, and you can see Rutte, clearly one of the leaders of the manufactured consensus, is nods along. So let's just watch Rutte.
President, you like
But he
winners.
won.
Mr.
That is
President,
correct.
you like winners. Do you think President Zelensky is winning right now? He famously.
Well, he's doing pretty well. Look, no matter how you look at it, he's doing pretty well. He's holding his own, at least. A lot of people dying on both sides.
So Rutte says absolutely, and then Trump says he's holding his own. Very different from what he said last year.
But I think he's doing pretty well.
Can I ask you?
Look, you have to say he's courageous. He's got great equipment, but he's got great men. He's got fighters.
Can I ask you one other question? Have you seen the?
All right, so that gives you a sense of the extent to which Trump has now moved towards the Europeans' position. It is almost as if he has agreed to, allow the Europeans to take the lead on this, on Ukraine. So let's just go back first of all to what happened. Was about, I don't know, what was it, 10 days ago, whatever, at the G7 summit, because that was a really moment when it seemed as if Trump has taken a different tack on Ukraine, because up until then he was either saying Ukraine is losing or just wants to say, I want to bring this thing to an end, but I don't, I'm not sufficiently interested. But here he suddenly embraced the European position. So remember, first of all, look at what was it that the G7 summit said in its final communique. This was in Evian, France, and just look at just what he says here. And here we have G7 leaders' statement on geopolitical issue. Ukraine. We, the leaders of the G7, stand united in our unwavering support for Ukraine. So that's already quite a strong movement on the part of the United States from where it stood, a year or so ago. Remember, it was now about what, 10 months ago since Trump met Putin in Anchorage, Alaska. So now, unwavering support for Ukraine. Trump had never said anything like that. He has unwavering support for Ukraine in defending its freedom, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. So already, the issue of territorial integrity brings into question what it was that Trump had supposedly agreed to in Alaska. And this is something that, and I want to come to that in a bit. This is the issue that the Russians keep bringing up again and again, that Trump had said things in Alaska which suggested that he wasn't at all committed to Ukraine's territorial integrity, and that he really wanted this war to come to an end, and the cessation of the fighting should not be conditioned on Ukraine restoring its territory circa 1991, because it's just not realistic. Ukraine doesn't have the capability of restoring its 1991 borders unless NATO gets directly involved in the fighting itself. And obviously, the United States doesn't want to do that. I mean, yeah, the Lithuanians, the Latvians, and the Chihuahuas or the Poles, yeah, they want to go. Yeah. Ukraine within its 1991 borders, but the United States knows better and doesn't really want to do that. But here, by he's now adopting a very, very strong position, which Biden had supported, but which Trump hadn't. And so here we have we reaffirm our solidarity with the Ukrainian population suffering from attacks on their critical infrastructure and cultural heritage. We commend Ukraine for its resilience and progress on the battlefield in recent months and emphasize that there is now a new momentum. So notice again, this is in its first bulletin, first bullet point, that there is now a new momentum. So that's the consensus. This is the manufacturing consensus that there is a new momentum. He says this, this is, von der Leyen says this, Kaya Kallas, Merz, Macron, they all kind of immediately repeat this. No real evidence for this other than, well, there's a new momentum. And they seem to have persuaded Trump, who does sound very different here from the way he spoke about Zelensky, because it is true that relations between Trump and Zelensky warmed a little bit after that disastrous Oval Office meeting. But nonetheless, Trump didn't maintain his distance from Ukraine. Trump never embraced the cause of Ukraine the way NATO's European states embraced it. He never did that. He always tried to maintain at least a more balanced approach. And here he is now signing on to this G7 statement, which is wholly, unconditionally on the side of Ukraine. So resilient and new momentum. And then it says, to support and accelerate this new momentum, we agree to increase the delivery of air defense capacities, additional systems and interceptors, and long-range capabilities. We are also ready to consider extending to Ukraine the benefit of licenses to allow for an increase in Ukraine's military production. And then we stress the importance of energy resilience on the basis of the needs and priorities expressed by Ukrainian authorities. We agree to provide further support to get the country through next winter. So again, big commitment there. We agree to provide further support to get the country through next winter. We commit to increase the pressure on the Russian war economy. In this context, we will strengthen our sanctions, including those on the oil and gas sectors. We consider this the right moment to proceed with additional measures, as President Trump has delivered a deal that we support in reopening the Strait of Hormuz. So the idea being that, well, now that the Iran war has come to an end, or at least the G7 smugly announced, now that it's come to an end, oil prices should start to go down. And so therefore, Russia will be more vulnerable to pressure from sanctions. And there was some indication, though, in various media reports, that Trump and Besant had agreed to end their sanctions waiver on Russia. Remember, they'd imposed a waiver on sanctions during the war on Iran because the world needed oil, so they lifted the sanctions. But now that prices have started to drop, the sanctions will be reimposed. That hasn't been formalized, but that nonetheless, there have been media reports suggesting that will happen. So that's in the this is the G7 statement. This is a kind of very, very exciting, almost Kaya Kallas will be salivating about this. We stress the importance of energy resilience, We agreed to provide further support to get the country through the winter, and we commit to increase the pressure on the Russian war economy, strengthen sanctions, including on those on the oil and gas sectors. We consider this the right moment to proceed with additional measures. And then Macron sent out this, exultant after the meeting in Evian. He says, since the G7 in Evian, we are living through an important moment, the reconvergence between Europeans and Americans on Ukraine and the Middle East. To move forward and support this momentum, I am meeting in Berlin with our German, British, Italian, and Polish partners. And then next key step, early July, NATO summit in Ankara will allow us to reaffirm a stronger Europe within NATO. So you can see he's really is the reconvergence between Europeans and Americans on Ukraine. So this is very much in keeping with that story that is being put out, that somehow Trump has abandoned all of the big talk, that he was going to just go ahead, try to conduct his U.S. mediation, U.S.-led negotiations, have talked to Putin, summits with Putin, all of that. Basically, Macron is saying exultantly, no, that's all gone. We're not going to have that. Europe and the United States are on the same page when it comes to Ukraine. But Macron went further than this. And if we just look at the story here, this is in Le Monde, which is very, very excited here with Merz saying, we're going to put pressure on the war economy, and then so on. And it said French President Emmanuel Macron hailed a very deep change in the U.S. approach toward Ukraine, saying Trump had understood that Russia's Vladimir Putin was not interested in peace. Now, that's very interesting because Trump hasn't said that. I mean, Trump hasn't distanced himself from all of these claims that he's on board with the Europeans on Ukraine, and he now believes in this united approach toward Russia, which all the media, he hasn't said, no, I disagree. That's not the U.S. position. However, that claim that Trump does not believe that Russia is sincere about peace, which would be a definite change from his position, because he, if you recall, the things he had said in the past, said, I think Putin wants to end this war. He said, I think both. I think Zelensky and Putin both want to end this war. And then when he's asked, well, how come they don't end it? He said, well, they hate each other so much, it's very difficult for them to come to an agreement. Nonetheless, in news conference after news conference, Trump has always insisted that Russia wants to end this war. But now here's Macron saying, no, Trump has come around to our position. Russia isn't interested in peace. And so here, and then Maloney, this phony baloney Maloney, says President Trump, like all of us, simply acknowledged that there was no serious willingness on Russia's part today to discuss peace. This is Maloney mouthing this mindless cliche. Maloney said that on Ukraine, there was a lot of convergence, which is not always obvious, and there was no friction or divergence. Throughout the summit, which was attended by Zelensky, Trump took a harder line against Moscow, saying Russia had to seek a deal and showing impatience over the casualty toll on both sides. Now, when Maloney says, no serious willingness on Russia's part to discuss peace, well, there's no willingness on Russia's part to discuss capitulation. I mean, it's not going to do that. But Russia's always, there's never been a moment in which Russia was not willing to discuss peace. It was willing to discuss peace, obviously, in Minsk, then in Istanbul. Was willing to discuss peace with Trump, went to Anchorage, Alaska. But when they say, oh, he's not willing to discuss peace, he's not willing to accept your terms. But, the kind of supplicant media, they never really challenge political leaders when they say that. They say, well, Russia's always been willing to discuss peace. They're just not willing to accept your terms. But you can see how Maloney is a total, absolute waste of space. She just mouths the same mindless drivel that everybody else in Europe does. I mean, like a total zero. But anyway, but Macron went beyond this. And so here's the story in Medusa, which said French President Emmanuel Macron said Donald Trump believed Ukraine would lose the war with Russia when he returned to the White House in early 2025, but has since changed his assessment. So this is now Macron being quoted. He thought Ukraine was going to lose. Everything went badly in the Oval Office during the meeting with Zelensky. Macron said in an interview with France TV, he added that the Trump-Putin summit in Anchorage raised fears of a deal under which Ukraine would be required to surrender territories Russia had not even captured. And then, after the Anchorage summit, Macron said European leaders traveled to Washington to persuade Trump that such terms were unacceptable. So, and that's, of course, you'll recall, that was that extraordinary meeting in the Oval Office when all of Europe's leaders sat right before Trump's desk, mischievous children in the school principal's office. And so here's Macron exultantly saying, we have come a very long way since then, and that path is first and foremost a victory for Ukrainians, their capabilities, and their persuasiveness. President Trump saw that everything he had been told, that Ukrainians would fall, that they would not survive the winter, turned out to be false. And then here's a longer story based on this interview that Macron gave. So this is RBC Ukraine. Macron says Trump was ready to give up Ukraine to Putin in Alaska. Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin were planning a large-scale division of Ukrainian territory. This took place during a meeting between the two leaders in Anchorage. In August 2025, a fateful document was nearly signed at the military base in Anchorage. The agreement reportedly envisaged the transfer of Ukrainian territories to Russia, with the Kremlin set to receive even land it did not control at the time. Well, yeah, I mean, the whole point, I mean, Russia was not going to agree to a ceasefire on the line of contact. So this is the point in saying that Russia had already said, we're not going to agree to a ceasefire on the line of contact. So what Russia was saying was, if you want a ceasefire, then at the minimum, Ukraine will have to evacuate the entirety of the Donbass. And so therefore, the territories that were still under Ukrainian control would have to be transferred to Russia. Now, the question is that, okay, well, then Russia would say, okay, well, if you're not going to transfer this territory, then the war will continue and we'll take this territory. We're not going to give up. We're just going to keep taking territory. So Trump at the time at least seemed to think, well, look, I think Russia will succeed eventually in taking this territory. And since they are going to take this territory eventually, then why not agree to a peace deal now rather than wait 2 years, get the same deal, by which time hundreds of thousands more people will be dead. That was the position that the Trump administration taken. But instead, Trump was persuaded by the Europeans that this was some betrayal, which means that the war has continued. Now, that raises a question, the important question, which is, yes, but with a view to what? What if you, by keeping the war going for another 10 months, and presumably keeping it going for another 10, 20, 30 months, what exactly are you accomplishing? What goals for you, for France, for Germany, for Europe, will you be accomplishing by doing that? Trump, who seemed at the time to see this, Trump, who seemed to have the sense to see this, no longer has the sense to see it. As I say, you listen to him, he's not really saying anything now of any interest. He seems somewhat passive in his approach to this war, and is bought into the line Macron is peddling, that Ukraine is winning this war. How Ukraine is winning, what exactly is Ukraine doing to win this war? That's never explained. They just say Ukraine is winning this war. And so, but Macron just couldn't help himself but gloat about how effective he had been in sidetracking Trump from the policy that he had embarked upon in 2025, but is since abandoned. And so he goes on in this interview. What did Trump see when he arrived at the Anchorage summit? They're quoting Macron here. He thought Ukraine was going to lose, so he wanted to strike a quick peace deal. You remember January, February 2025? It feels like an eternity ago. He believed Ukraine would lose. Things had gone badly in the Oval Office with Zelensky. Then, less than a year ago, there was a meeting in Anchorage when an agreement was already almost on the table, which said that we would give up Ukrainian territory that had not even been captured yet. According to the French president, the situation was saved by decisive European intervention. In mid-August 2025, a special delegation urgently flew to the United States. Merz, Macron, Maloney, von der Leyen, they're all there. European leaders issued an ultimatum calling the deal impossible. Diplomats explained to the White House the real situation on the ground. Ukraine continued to fight despite all pessimistic predictions. The French president stressed, "We tried, and since then so much has happened. This path is above all and mostly a victory of the Ukrainians in their capacity and reliability." President Trump saw that everything he was being told, that Ukrainians would lose, that they would not make it through the winter, was false. Today, the American leader's position is fundamentally different, the French president said. The resilience of the Ukrainian armed forces and society forced Trump to reassess his views. Instead of plans for capitulation, respect has emerged. And then Trump acknowledged that earlier assessments were wrong. Ukrainians proved their reliability in practice, which changed the geopolitical landscape. According to Macron, Trump now views Ukraine with deep respect. Now he sees courageous, innovative people whom he respects. Now, this is very, very strange, because all Macron is promising here, despite all the bluster about how Ukraine is winning, is Ukraine can keep the war going. Well, okay, you can keep a war going. But at what cost and to what end? And this Macron never asks, and he seems, at least because Macron is suggesting that Trump is now on board with the Europeans, that this is Trump's position. Oh well, Ukraine is doing fantastically well. But then you have to say, okay, the idea that Russia will collapse is ludicrous. It is a laughable notion. There's no evidence that Russia is on the brink of collapse. There's no evidence that Russia is going to give up. It's a fantastical idea based on some ridiculous, stupid historical notion peddled by some cretin like Radek Sikorsky. Oh, well, the Russians collapsed in World War One, and then, of course, the entire Russian Empire collapsed, the government collapsed, and the Bolsheviks took over, and Russia was out of the war. Well, that's fantastic. Now, leave aside the obvious question, and you think that's a good thing? This was an absolute historical catastrophe for not just for Russia, but for the entire world. The collapse of Russia, the rise of the Bolsheviks, and then, of course, the extreme reaction, as was inevitable, the extreme reaction that Bolshevik rule would generate in other countries. So that's one obvious point, which is, well, you think that's a great model to look to, the collapse in World War One, but then you have the other much more salient model, which is Russia didn't collapse during World War II, despite the huge military setbacks that the Soviet Union suffered. It didn't collapse. So Macron, as he blusters like an idiot here, is kind of talking, talking absolute nonsense with the suggestion, oh, well, Trump is now on board, so we don't have to worry anymore that he's going to go off and try to negotiate behind our backs with Putin. Trump is now on board to keep this war going for whatever length of time, and presumably, and I don't know what goes on in Macron's mind, but it's possible that what he's thinking is that if Trump can keep this war going for another 2 years, then Trump will be replaced by somebody much more enthusiastic about the war than he is, because he's still not really, his heart isn't really in it. But he doesn't seem to be resisting the Europeans any longer. And so you think, okay, well, keep it going for 2 years, and then we'll get somebody else in who will be much more Atlanticist and much more Russophobic and much more on our page. And, we'll just look back on Anchorage as as this nightmare. And then here again, we have Macron saying the French president also believes that Europeans must be at the negotiating table when talks begin, as EU interests are directly linked to developments in Ukraine. This is true thanks to the support we have provided through the enlargement issue that concerns Europeans and through the financial assistance and loans we have provided. Now, this is obviously utterly ridiculous. I only need to repeat what Viktor Orban famously said in February 2025 on the issue of the Europeans being at the negotiating table. He said, look, you can't just demand a seat at the negotiating table. You have to deserve a seat at the negotiating table. And the only way that you can get a seat at the negotiating table is by demonstrating an interest in peace. If you're not interested in peace, as the Europeans are not, then you don't get a seat at the table. And of course, that's the point. That's why when Macron says, "Oh, we want a seat at the table," he means, how can we ensure that there's going to be no peace? Because we're going to sit at the table and make ridiculous demands that have no chance of being fulfilled, and that'll ensure that the talks go nowhere. And anyway, so that, it's Macron, and then because Macron said that agreed and so on. And then here there is, he says, Macron was saying there's no genuine willingness from Russia, to make peace. And then here, Macron hailed a very deep change in the U.S. approach toward Ukraine. President Trump, like all of us, simply acknowledged that there was no serious willingness on Russia's part today to discuss peace. It just keeps repeating the same point. And then here again, Guardian, Macron hails U.S. alignment with G7 shared commitment on Ukraine. And here you can see that it says, Macron said, "I have always trusted President Trump. When he has made commitments to us, he has always done what he said he would do." And then we have Mark Carney, who said he believed Trump has shifted to a more realistic understanding of how this war will develop. He described this as a game changer. And here is the Financial Times, a usual bellwether of conventional thinking, of consensus thinking. And here we have, again, Trump was hugely impressed and enthusiastic about Ukraine's recent campaign of long-range strikes on targets deep inside Russia. And then says, these strikes, which have since intensified with attacks on military targets around Moscow and an oil refinery on the outskirts of the city, are supported by U.S. intelligence, which Western allies have urged Washington to continue providing. And then so on. Anyways, recently as March, U.S. intelligence officials believe that Russia had the upper hand in the war, but in recent months, European diplomats noted that U.S. officials appeared to have shifted and no longer felt that Moscow was winning the war. And they quote Rubio saying they're not going to achieve the objectives they set out on day one for certain. And so this is Rubio. They may not even be able to militarily ever achieve the objectives they're demanding now in negotiations. And so, and to add the icing on the cake, there was a conference, a conference today at in Gdansk. And now people will remember, people who remember their history will remember, of course, that Gdansk, this is a Polish city, used to be a German city known as Danzig, and which was the site of the start of the war and of World War II, because Danzig had been declared a free city. The Treaty of Versailles wasn't really assigned to Poland; it was a free city. Obviously, for Poland to get access to it, it needed to make use of the Polish corridor, which split East Prussia off from the rest of Germany. And this, of course, infuriated the Germans, and eventually, as was inevitable, the Germans would get fed up with this, and this, the series of events that led to World War II. Anyway, during the wartime negotiations, Danzig was assigned to Poland proper, so it was substantially more than had been the case before the war, when it was just a free city. Now Danzig became a Polish city, and now it's a Gdansk. And of course, Gdansk was the birthplace of solidarity, and a lot of people still remember the glory days of the 1980s and the Solidarność movement against the communist regime in Poland. So, but anyway, so today there were two conferences that took place in Gdansk. There was the Ukraine Recovery Conference, where countries were promised, arrived to promise the billions that they would invest in Ukraine. That's the Ukraine recovery. And then there was an Eastern Flank Conference, which is a bunch of Looney Tunes, demented states in Europe. And many states in Europe are just Looney Tunes and completely off their rocker. So that was the Eastern Flank Conference. Ursula von der Leyen attended both meetings in Gdansk and spoke at both. And but I think what was interesting was that in that Ukraine Recovery Conference, there was a guy from the U.S. State Department. He had some quite a senior position, who seemed to echo just that: Ukraine is winning this war. Ukraine's going to win this war. So let's first of all just take a look at this the lead up to this Ukraine Recovery Conference. So first, von der Leyen, Ursula, who's always got a lot to say. So she's talking about the Eastern Flank Summit. So she's there, and she was kind of, I guess, she gets into a car, takes her from one, then she comes back to the other, then that takes her back to the other one, and so hey, it's a living. So she says at the Eastern Flank Summit in Gdansk, with the latest drone incursions, Russia is bringing war to our doorstep. So this is the part at which with the Europeans, they can never make their mind up. Is it that we're doing a fantastic job and we are really hitting the Russians where it hurts? Boom, we're really hitting them here, hitting them there. Then we get to the other theme. Oh, we're being hit by Russia. Poor little us. We're being hit. We're being bullied. We're being terrorized. We're under attack. See, it's very difficult. That's the thing. She goes from one conference to another and she comes up with a different thing. Hey, it's fantastic. We're really hitting the Russians. To, we're being hit by Russia. Oh, what are we going to do? Please save us. Anyway, so here with the Eastern Flank Conference, she has to present that we're all under attack by Russia. Even though, as we've seen, almost all of these attacks are actually Ukrainian drones and missiles. And Russia is bringing the war to our doorstep. We are making the Eastern Flank Watch operational with SAFE and developing it into an important pillar of Europe's security architecture. And here then is von der Leyen. The courage of Ukraine's armed forces has shifted the momentum on the battlefield. The tide is turning. The tide is turning. That's it. That's the line. The tide is turning. And the resolve of the Ukrainian people has shown to the world that their European choice cannot be broken. Ukraine will prevail, grow, prosper. So that's for the Ukraine Recovery Conference. Ukraine will prevail, grow, and prosper. And then the other one for the Eastern Flank Conference, a couple of miles from the other meeting place. Different messages for each. And then here is the picture of the Ukraine Recovery Conference, well attended. And then we have, again, von der Leyen boasting, over the past year, we have strengthened Ukraine's economic foundations, we have advanced its European path, and we have created new opportunities for growth. Now is the time to invest in Ukraine, a future member of a single market worth 20 trillion. Well, that's very interesting because how can you invest in a country that's mired in a war? A war whose outcome is, to say the least, very uncertain. You're going to invest in that? Who's you're going to put money and and I mean, for all we know, this could still end up in a nuclear exchange. The odds for that are pretty good. And then she says, "Oh, it's going to be a part of a market that's worth 20 trillion." Well, how do you know that? I mean, that's some way down the road. You're going to be a member of a market, 20 trillion euro market. But anyway, von der Leyen, there's this whole bluster, and then she goes on. I mean, she was in a real Twitter flurry today. In Gdansk, a city that helped shape the course of Polish and European history, here people showed that freedom can prevail over oppression and so on and so forth. Solidarity is the road to freedom. Anyway, that's that. But here is what happened at this Ukraine recovery conference, because it was a little bit of a disappointment. I mean, von der Leyen shows up, Merz shows up. Maloney and Macron couldn't make it because they were in the Riviera trying to resolve their differences. Macron and Maloney have never been great pals. We've seen footage when Maloney has been rolling her eyes in exasperation and boredom when listening to Macron, but now apparently Macron has decided that he and Maloney should bury the hatchet, so they're meeting in Ibiza to bury the hatchet. So they couldn't make it to this Gdansk conference. But another person who didn't make it to this Gdansk conference was Zelensky himself, which would seem odd because the whole point is the Ukraine recovery conference. This is all about putting money into Ukraine, rebuilding Ukraine. But the reason he didn't show up was the scandal that arose out of the rescinding of this award that had been given to Zelensky by the state of Poland. As you know, Zelensky had renamed a unit of the Ukrainian armed forces after the UPA, which was the World War II collaborationist military that had fought alongside the Nazis, which probably would be forgiven by most, certainly by the Germans. But the problem was that they killed a lot of Poles. And so it was very difficult for the Polish nationalist government of Nawrocki, which was the one that said, well, we're going to withdraw this award to Zelensky because you can't very well honor the UPA. I mean, this is a collaborationist army, and it killed Poles. Now, that was just Nawrocki's position. It wasn't shared by others within the government. It wasn't the position of Donald Tusk, the Polish prime minister, and it wasn't shared by Radek Sikorski. So anyway, Zelensky said he wasn't going to show up because of this insult that had been administered to him, and therefore the Ukrainian delegation would be led by Poland's prime minister. Not Poland's, sorry, Ukraine's prime minister. But Nawrocki himself said, well, I'm not going to show up. So neither Nawrocki nor Zelensky were at this Ukraine recovery conference. Well, as I said, neither was Maloney and Macron. They were trying to kiss and make up on the Riviera. Anyway, so here, this is the Reuters story about this. It says Ukraine has downgraded its representation at the key recovery forum in Poland by sending Prime Minister Yulia Sviridenko instead of President Zelensky in an effort to insulate the conference from a simmering diplomatic row. And then here we have Sviridenko says, our delegation has a clear mission to secure concrete agreements that will strengthen Ukraine's defense capabilities and resilience while expanding economic cooperation with our partners. And then asked about Zelensky's planned absence, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said, I'm not disappointed. From my perspective, this means that the conference may even run more efficiently without unnecessary tensions. And I see it as a gesture to de-escalate tensions. Anyway, then it goes on. So that was the kind of an embarrassment for the meeting, but nonetheless it went ahead, and there was the Ukrainian prime minister rather than Zelensky, who represented the position. Now, the one thing I wanted to point out was that at the Ukrainian Recovery Conference was the senior U.S. official he was working in the State Department, working for Marco Rubio, who said, and this is quite a strong statement by a member of the Trump administration, that Ukraine is winning this war. So let's just take a look at this person. I have to say, I've never heard of him. And here is this the report, which is U.S. State Department says Ukraine is winning, pledges continued sanctions coordination. The U.S. State Department believes that Ukraine is currently at a stage where it will win the war. This position was stated by Jeremy Levin, the Deputy Secretary of State for Foreign Assistance, Humanitarian Affairs, and Freedom of Religion. I don't think he's Deputy Secretary of State. I think he's Assistant Secretary of State. During a speech at a luncheon in Gdansk. According to Levin, Ukraine is actively working to document a new phase of the war and is pursuing victory. And already the situation on the front has been tilted in the country's favor. He stressed that from today's standpoint, Ukraine is in a position that allows talking about victory in the context of current events. Levin also noted that in earlier periods, Ukrainian forces expected winter when the Russians could pause, but now the situation is unfolding in the opposite way. Ukraine is advancing while Russia waits for winter. He said that even during such a winter, Ukrainians managed to shift the dynamics and strike infrastructure in the Russian Federation, underscoring mounting pressure on the aggressor. Now is a very important moment. Ukraine can continue to exert pressure on the front. The official also reminded of the possible review of sanctions policy towards Russian oil and assured that the United States will continue to cooperate with European partners on sanctions. So this is a completely imbecilic statement. But as I said, it's said by a senior official within the State Department that, Ukraine is really advancing, and, this winter, they're going to be on the march. So there's no evidence. Ukraine hasn't been on the march since 2022. I mean, you could say they have fought tenaciously. I don't think that's in doubt. But they haven't been on the march. But this now seems to have become as I say, the consensus that how well Ukraine is doing. Now, the the other thing that I think is quite interesting on this is uh, the Russians, as you know, have been insisting really for ever since the Anchorage meeting that something or other was agreed upon in Anchorage, and that the Americans, the Trump administration, has gone back on its word. Now, the Russians have never explicitly stated what was agreed upon in Anchorage. But the suggestion is, and it's just like in the various stories that we just looked at, the suggestion is that the United States would push Ukraine to withdraw from the Donbass. So the whole of the Donbass would be transferred to Russia, and the fighting would be frozen in Kherson and Zaporozhye. But that it's never really been spelled out. The way the Russians have claimed, and Lavrov is the one who has been the most vociferous about this, is that, well, we were very close to an agreement, and that somehow the Americans walked back on the agreement. So Marco Rubio was asked about this when he was in Bahrain. Well, the Russians are saying that an agreement was reached in Anchorage and that you walked away from that agreement. And so let's see what Rubio said in response to that. So this is, first of all, this is the Reuters story on this. Russia wants to know if Trump has shifted his stance on Ukraine. And then they say, Russia wants to know if Donald Trump has really changed his stance on the Ukraine war. Because obviously, the Russians are reading all these stories and all this gloating by Macron about how Russia has embraced, about how the United States has now embraced Macron's position. And this is, and they quote Lavrov saying, as far as Ukraine is concerned, we want to understand what happened in Evian. The Americans haven't yet told us what they took away from the summit in Evian or what their future course of action will be. Lavrov quoted Macron as saying that understandings reached last August between Trump and Putin had been buried at Evian. And then here is Rubio in Bahrain today, and he's asked, Mr. Secretary, what about Russia before you go? And it says, Russia is accusing the US of failing to deliver on, quote unquote, agreements or understanding. And then Rubio chimes in, there was never any agreement. And that we had in Alaska, yeah. Can you please, there was no agreement in Alaska. There was a proposal in Alaska, but there was no agreement in Alaska. If there had been an agreement, we would have had an end to the war. So as I said, the president is prepared, as the United States remains prepared, to play whatever constructive role we can to bring about an enduring end to this war in Ukraine, and which has been bloody, 25 to 20,000 soldiers killed every month, 5,000 a week, most of them Russian. And it's very strange that they just say this, 5,000 a week, most of them Russian, but I guess that's, you have to maintain this line that most of them are Russian. The difficulty about maintaining that statistics, and I can't say I know what the real statistics are, is that whenever there is an exchange of bodies of fallen soldiers involving Russia and Ukraine, the Russians always hand over far more Ukrainian bodies than the Ukrainians hand over Russian bodies. Now there may be reasons for that, and but nonetheless, it's a peculiar thing to keep saying, "Oh, the Russians are losing 3, 4, 5, 6 times more men than Ukraine is," and yet, where's the evidence for that? The Russians hand over far more Ukrainian bodies than Ukrainians hand over Russian bodies. But anyway, that's the number that Rubio is going with. So it's been debilitating for Europe, but especially for Ukraine and for Russia increasingly. So if we're prepared to step forward and play a constructive role, if there's one for us to play in bringing the parties together and bringing the war to an end, that's what the president's tried to do now for a year and a half. But there was no agreement in Alaska. There was a proposal made in Alaska, but it was never an agreement. You mean by Russia or by the US? It's the same thing. You've seen publicly reported, right? Russia wants the entirety of Donetsk to be turned over to them, among some other things that they raised, but there was never an agreement. Had there been an agreement, there would have been an end to the war, and that's been the fundamental problem. All right, so now I have to say, however ineffectual Trump has been, because if you're launching a diplomatic initiative, such as the meeting in Alaska, it's a big move, a very controversial move, but it was a bold, daring initiative, which has the power to bring this thing to an end. So Trump had to have known that there would be huge resistance from Ukraine to this move, and there would be a huge resistance from NATO to this move. And you can see here, Macron's talking about how terrible they felt at the time of the Anchorage meeting. So having done this, then he should have followed through on it, rather than allowed the whole thing to evaporate. So that's unquestionably the case. Nevertheless, what Rubio says here, I think, is true. When he says there was no agreement, there was never an agreement. And I think Lavrov does not serve Russia's cause well by suggesting there was some sort of an agreement. Now, the exact mechanics of this agreement, because the way Lavrov and Putin have formulated it, that the proposal was Witkoff's about this, Ukrainian withdrawal from Donetsk, and that once Witkoff, who was assumed to be speaking on behalf of Trump, had made that proposal, then Russia said, well, okay, if that's your proposal, we would agree to it. And that's what the Anchorage meeting was about. And so there they were, and Putin repeated to Trump, is this what you're proposing? Is this what you're proposing? And Trump says, yeah, that's what we're proposing. And then they left, and of course then we know all about the rest. But I don't think it's correct to say that there was an agreement. And Trump gave no indication in Anchorage after the summit that an agreement had been reached. He just simply said that, well, we're very close. There's only just a few minor differences that need to be sorted out, but we're very close. But nothing was signed, and nothing was published. No document was ever published. No memorandum, no draft of an agreement, no draft of a proposal for an agreement. Nothing like that was ever published. So effectively, the way they left it was that, well, we will go back, we'll talk to our allies, and then we'll get back to you. So I think Rubio is correct to say there was no agreement. That, as I say, that doesn't get Trump off the hook. But I think in those terms, and now, if it is the case, and there seems to be quite a lot of evidence, everything that we've looked at today, there's quite a lot of evidence that Trump now seems to have kind of, out of exhaustion, embraced the European position on Ukraine. He just isn't in the mood for any more peace initiatives. Then, the Anchorage was really the last opportunity to bring this war to a conclusion sometime in the near future. Because otherwise, I think it's just going to go on and on. And Lavrov spoke at some length about this the other day. And here he's saying that he was asked a question about Anchorage. And then here he says, we were happy by the opening of the from the United States. But then he says that in February 2025, that was at the time of the first diplomatic outreach from Trump, which was the meeting in Riyadh. U.S. President Donald Trump has repeatedly stated that there should be no NATO for Ukraine. Since taking office, he has repeatedly stated that this Russian position is completely understandable. No one wants such a military irritant on their borders. Trump did indeed say that, very reasonable. He said, yeah, of course Russia doesn't want NATO on its borders. And then Lavrov went on that, some time has passed. For several months now, NATO Secretary General, they call him Marcus Rutte. Unfortunately, this is a machine translation, and they often garble names. So he's Mark Rutte, not Marcus Rutte. And Rutte said, and we talked about this last week, that the door to NATO is open for Ukraine. And then it says that but that everything has changed significantly. So he's saying, on June the 23rd of this year, Kievskaya Pravda, a Ukrainian media outlet, reported that after his meeting with Zelensky in Evian, U.S. President Donald Trump gave the go-ahead for tightening sanctions against Russia, other forms of pressure, and an intensification of military action against Russian territory, including deep strikes, according to an anonymous source. And then he says, I'd like to emphasize that before the meeting in Alaska, Witkoff arrived with a very specific proposal. Russian President Putin took it into consideration, and in Anchorage, he told President Trump that there were some nuances that he would take on. He accepted the American proposal, but it was a compromise. Now they're telling us, and so on, if we're not getting anywhere, let's get into something else. And then he says, after Alaska in September 2025, I met with Rubio. Again, he's not, he's Miguel Rubio. He's Marco Rubio. He said they were reminding him of our expectations. He said they were working and there were difficulties. That was their proposal. Meanwhile, shortly after New York, Biden's sanctions were extended once again. So that's in September of last year. And Trump's sanctions were imposed on Lukoil and Rosneft. And then, in other words, we haven't accomplished anything positive in practice. And then returning to where we began, the Ukrainian issue, we want to understand what happened in Evian. Because if you listen to President Macron, Anchorage is buried. And the US President Trump, like a prodigal son or prodigal father, has returned to the family, and now, therefore, they are together again. But the Americans haven't yet told us what they took away from the G7 summit, how they see its outcome, and what their future course of action will be. As Russian presidential aide Ushakov and Dmitry Peskov have stated, the next visit, Witkoff and Kushner, is under discussion. So you can see how the Russians are doing this thing, which is really quite pointless. Which is, well, we were led by the nose. We were misled by the Americans. We were misled by the Europeans. We were told one thing, and the Americans didn't follow through. Well, of course, the Americans didn't follow through. Of course they didn't. Of course NATO didn't follow through. Of course NATO broke its word. Of course they broke all of their promises. I mean, you're lucky they don't attack you while you're negotiating, as Iran got twice attacked while it was negotiating. So that's the way they act. That's what they're always going to do. Now, in this case, I would say that that it's a little disingenuous to claim that there was an agreement. There was no agreement in Alaska. I mean, it's hard to know whether Trump knew exactly what the setup was in Alaska and what Witkoff had suggested, whether Trump had actually signed on to the Witkoff proposal. But there's no agreement. There's very little point in talking about the spirit of Alaska. Now, when Lavrov says, well, we want to know whether Macron is right, has Anchorage been now buried, then I'll give an absolutely unambiguous answer, which is, yeah, Anchorage is buried. Anchorage is dead and gone. It's not coming back. You can, there may be some other things that might come up. There might be other initiatives. Trump may return to the subject, but right now he's shaken, obviously, by what happened in Iran. He wants this thing off his plate, and he just doesn't have the energy. That he doesn't have the requisite level of interest to get involved in Ukraine. So this little point, the subject of Anchorage is dead. And I think Macron is right to say it's dead, it's buried, gone. No point in bringing it up. It's as pointless as bringing up something that, we all do because it's interesting historically. The famous meeting in the Kremlin between Gorbachev and, of course, U.S. Secretary of James Baker in February 1990, during which James Baker said NATO will not move 1 inch to the east. We know, of course, that was a lie. But the same thing, he goes, yeah, there was no agreement in Anchorage. And I think Rubio is right in saying there was no agreement. And there's very little point. There's very little point in finding this some place where you discuss something and it seemed like you were in agreement, and they say, well, we were lied to, we were deceived. Yes, that's what they do. That's what they will always do. Oh, we withdrew from Kiev, and we thought that this was preliminary to the signing of an agreement. No, of course, it wasn't going to be preliminary to everything. You withdrew, and once you withdrew, you no longer had any leverage. Yeah, that's generally the way it goes in war. You don't withdraw. You never withdraw anything. Look at the way the Iranians are handling it. They don't withdraw anything. But if you withdraw before you've signed anything, then you don't have any leverage. And when it came to Anchorage, essentially it was a matter of, all right, you go back and talk to your people, we'll go back and talk to our people and see where it goes. Anyway, I will now turn to our locals page, our locals contributors. These are the people who support the Gaggle. These are the people who ensure that the Gaggle keeps going, so the Gaggle is able to do the journalism that we do, and above all, it ensures that the dogs are fed, watered, kept happy. And as I say to always during every live stream, if you want to interact with me, if you want to uh, uh, have me answer your questions, please join our locals community, great community, and these are the questions that I'm able to answer, the ones that are posted on our locals board. So the way you join is through the gaggle.locals.com. And then you can ask me questions and so on, because I can't answer the questions on YouTube. I'm not able to follow all of that. So the gaggle.locals.com. It's a great community, and you definitely will not miss. You will not be disappointed in it. Anyway, here is Danaki, one of the most stalwart members of the community. He says, since the string of victories is undeniable for 4 years straight, and especially the last 2 years, ain't you tired of all the winning? I think I'm going to trademark the prophetic words. Special needs op is going great here. Well, no question. I mean, the ridiculous, the overstated predictions of fantastic Russian victories, swift Russian victories, now look ridiculous in retrospect. And they're particularly ridiculous because they were coming from people who purported to be military experts. And so these are the military people who told us in the early days of this war that, oh, Russia has complete air dominance. Ukraine already has nothing. Essentially, Russia's involved in a mop-up operation. It's all going to be over very, very quickly. We remember all the people. We don't have to name names. Everybody knows who they are. And that was February 2022, so that's already getting on for 4.5 years ago. And now a number of these people have continued to repeat the same thing, despite the fact that their predictions of a swift, decisive Russian victory have not been borne out. They continue to predict a swift and decisive Russian victory. Now, that there is a market for that. That's how they make money, and I don't want to stand between anyone and their money making, but we shouldn't really take them seriously. I mean, when people cite some site or some so-called expert as if their statements are worth anything, we should just ignore them. Now, having said that, I also don't accept the declarations of the other side, the ones that we've been talking about today, namely that Ukraine is on the march, Russia is facing defeat, and that somehow, in some mysterious way, Ukraine is going to defeat Russia, push Russia out of Ukraine. Though they don't quite put it like that, they somehow argue, because if they were to claim that Ukraine is going to defeat Russia, push Russia out of Ukraine, that is so obviously stupid and nonsensical that people are going to laugh at that. So they don't actually say that. They say, well, Ukraine is winning, and therefore Ukraine will force Putin to the negotiating table, even though it's the same strategy that NATO has been pursuing for more than 4 years, which is where you keep applying sanctions, you keep hitting Russia, and that will force Russia to the negotiating table. That's not going to happen. But because our friendly media, they don't really ask Macron or von der Leyen or any of the others to explain, how do you envisage this Ukrainian victory? How does this happen? Are they going to mount an offensive and drive the Russians, who are thoroughly embedded inside the Donbass? I mean, they pretty much 98% of Lugansk is under Russian control. Some 80% of Donetsk is under Russian control. 70% of Kherson, 70% of Zaporozhye are under Russian control. What are the mechanics of pushing the Russians out of this huge amount of territory? They never explain that. And that way they can just go on appropriating billions and billions and billions of taxpayer euros to keep this war going. So, I'd say there's a lot of bad faith and a lot of lying on both sides. And I think it's a reasonable prediction, and I'm going to make this reasonable prediction, that this war is going to go on for some time. There's no prospect of this coming to an end anytime in the future. I think the war will outlast the Trump presidency, and who knows, it may even outlast the Putin presidency. Anyway, thank you so much, Danaki, and thank you so much for all of your really superb postings on our locals board. Cynthia, always very good to see you. Cynthia is one of the stars of the Gaggle community, where, as I always introduce her, an amazing film expert, a film scholar, a film specialist with an extraordinarily encyclopedic knowledge of history of cinema in Europe, in the United States, in Asia. And not only that, she knows an amazing amount about the production of films. And we're very lucky to have her here at the Gaggle, and even luckier to have her offer the benefits of her extraordinary knowledge concerning the films that we screen here. So we screen a movie every week, and always interesting movies. And to go with the movie is Cynthia's very, very learned, very informative, and always fascinating commentary. So this week we're featuring films about international sporting events, and the film that we're screening is Grand Prix from 1966. Interesting film to watch, not the greatest film ever made by any stretch of the imagination, but still an interesting film, and an interesting film of its time. So enjoy the film, and enjoy, above all, Cynthia's accompanying, intriguing commentary. So thank you so much, Cynthia, for that. Anyway, Cynthia says here, few will miss Starmer. Yeah, well, I'm one of them. I won't be missing him. But he at least won a real election. Absolutely right. His replacement, Andy Burnham, has zero Democratic backing. Correct. Sneaking into Parliament through a rigged by-election that totally shut out voters. Yes. Critics see right through him, just another establishment clone who will eagerly obey Trump, the Zionist lobby, or the City of London. Why do British voters tolerate this pathetic farce? There's all excellent points. And the thing about Burnham, which is particularly irksome, because let's say you could remove the leader of a party and prime minister during his term in office. Not a good situation, because ultimately, I mean, he can certainly resign and be replaced by whoever the party decides should be the replacement. Say Harold Wilson in 1976 had won 2 elections in 1974, and then he just stepped aside in 76 and was replaced by James Callaghan, who was elected by the party. Now, there were a number of candidates who stood for the position of leader and prime minister in 1976. James Callaghan won, as I say, among a number of candidates. Tony Blair also stepped aside in 2007, and he was then replaced by Gordon Brown. So in those cases, you can say, well, democracy was still being observed, even though there had been an election, and the election involved the party, the leader, the manifesto, the platform, and every single MP who supported all of that, also who supported the leader, the party, the program, the manifesto. So you can say, okay, well, Blair is gone, he's replaced by Gordon Brown. Wilson is gone, he's replaced by Callaghan. But in the case of Burnham, it's a little tricky, because Burnham didn't stand in the 2024 election. He wasn't an MP. So the election that was won, albeit very unconvincingly, by Keir Starmer's Labour, Burnham wasn't a part of that. He didn't stand in that election. He wasn't an MP who was swept into office by on the coattails of Starmer and the endorsement of Labour. Burnham was outside. He was the mayor of Greater Manchester, and now he's been essentially parachuted in order to take over as party leader and to take over as prime minister, without any kind of at least a leadership contest within the party. So there are a number of irksome things about it. First of all, he didn't stand in 2024, which is the reason why Labour has this huge majority in Parliament. He wasn't a part of that election. Then it's irksome that Starmer has been pushed aside, and he has been pushed aside by a rebellion within his own party. And the party, instead of making its case to the voters and say, well, we're going to have an election, the party said, no, well, we'll just push aside Starmer and have him replaced by somebody else who we think will be more of a vote getter than Starmer was. So that's another thing that is irksome. And then another irksome aspect of it is that Burnham really doesn't have any experience of anything. I mean, he doesn't have experience of holding a senior governmental position. He certainly has no experience of being prime minister. So he's essentially just being thrust in. Oh, you're now prime minister, even though you weren't part of the Labour platform, Labour victory of 2024. You weren't a part of that. You don't have any senior governmental experience. You haven't been a part of the Starmer government. And you're just simply being brought in for what reason? Well, that apparently you have some kind of a popular appeal. But we don't know that. We don't know whether he has any popular appeal. And he may well fall flat on his face very, very quickly. Let's remember the Conservatives did very much the same thing. I mean, Johnson won overwhelmingly in 2019, but proved to be a disastrous prime minister. He was then overthrown, replaced by Liz Truss. But at least in the case of Liz Truss, there had been a contest within the party. She won a contest, and became prime minister, but lasted really just a few weeks. And then she was replaced by Rishi Sunak, and there was no contest. He was just shoved in as prime minister. So that was also a complete outrage. I mean, once you remove Boris Johnson, it was Johnson who led the party in 2019. Then you should have an election. You can't just replace him by somebody else, and then have that person replaced by somebody else again. But at least in those cases, both Truss and Rishi Sunak had been members of the Johnson cabinet. And they were elected with Johnson in 2019. In this case, Burnham doesn't have any legitimacy. It's an absolute mockery of any kind of democratic procedure. So when we ask, well, why do people put up with it? I have no idea. There's a lot of things that I don't know why people put up with it. But I mean, I mean, Labour has been sold a bill of goods. They think that Andy Burnham is a vote winner. They say, look at Burnham. He won this huge by-election victory, got 55% of the vote. If he can do that, he can win 55%, while Labour is historically unpopular, while reform is apparently surging. If he can do that, boy, he can lead us to victory. I think it's a very foolish way of thinking, very opportunistic, and I don't think it's going to succeed. So I think we're going to have the same kind of quick collapse, a la Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak with Burnham. Anyway, thank you, Cynthia. And then Cynthia says the specific crisis highlights a systemic rot, a decade of chaos featuring 7 unelected leaders. Were they 7? Are they all unelected leaders? Well, I mean, Johnson had been elected. I mean, so Johnson had been elected. May had been elected. Cameron had been elected. I mean, certainly May had been elected leader and then became prime minister without first going through the whole process of a general election. Then she'd had a general election after she became prime minister, and of course that election proved to be catastrophic. And she never really recovered from that. But I mean, Johnson certainly went through the whole process of election, but he turned out to be a complete disaster, as anybody with any common sense could have seen he would. But yes, but of course, Starmer himself was, of course, a truly deplorable figure, because he really betrayed Jeremy Corbyn. It was Corbyn who had really appointed him into his shadow cabinet, had made him essentially the number 2 to Corbyn, and then Starmer repaid the favor by kicking Corbyn out of the party altogether. I mean, that's quite something. I mean, just you kick him out of the Labour Party altogether. So Starmer deserves no sympathy whatsoever. A very nasty, unlikable man. Anyway, 7 unelected leader. While bad growth and toxic media pressure fuel the fire, this constant swapping masks a deeper corruption. Our cowardly parties weaponizing their internal midterm coups on purpose, just to keep power within the establishment and permanently block a disruptive outsider from bringing real change. Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's what it is. The British system is a very peculiar one, because of the first past the post system, which makes it very difficult for outsider parties to break through. And when outsider parties do break through, as seemingly Nigel Farage's reform did in 2024, and then Farage's apparent surge in the polls, mysteriously divisions appear among that small outsider party, and lo and behold, now there are two parties on the populist right. There's Farage's reform, and then Rupert Lowe's restore. And that, of course, undermines the possibility of a real challenge to the political establishment. And so that always works very, very well to the political establishment in Britain. And there have been times when a third party seemed to be challenging the status quo, and the status quo nearly always managed to reassert itself. Another peculiarity of the British system is the extent to which the political and media and security establishment are so tied up with the political parties. So when you look at the Conservative parties, everybody hates the Conservative Party because it's such a hateful party, and it doesn't conserve anything, it doesn't really stand for anything, and hasn't conserved anything or stood for anything in years. But nonetheless, it's able to corral the very powerful media establishment. So in the Conservative corner is Rupert Murdoch's The Times, Rupert Murdoch's The Sun, Rupert Murdoch's Talk TV, and then you've got Axel Springer's Telegraph, and then you also have GB News, and then of course you have the Daily Mail. So that's a huge chunk of the media establishment already thoroughly embedded within the Conservative Party. This media has no interest in anything other than ensuring that the Conservatives are re-elected. So however poorly the Conservatives are now doing, they're going to do better. They're going to push the Conservatives. They're going to keep, telling the electorate that Kemi Badenoch is a really great figure, that she's a true leader of the party. She's the heir to Margaret Thatcher. And however absolutely useless, totally idiotic nincompoop Kemi Badenoch is, she will have the media behind her. And as long as you don't have the mechanics of challenging that, you don't really have the medias that can support an insurgency, and don't really have the resources. I mean, it requires amazing resources just to win a few constituencies via the first past the post system. Via the first past the post system means to win, you need to get something like 40% of the vote in about 200 constituencies. Well, good luck with that. So that the system in Great Britain is very, very hard to shake, which is why the two political parties, Tories and Labour, have essentially dominated the scene for more than 100 years. Unlike other countries, when new parties have emerged and have challenged the status quo, Britain, it has been absolutely rock solid. It was impossible to challenge it. Anyway, then Cynthia goes on. The Kiev Independent reports that Zelensky believes he has Trump's backing. Yeah, I think that's there. A number of outlets have repeated that. According to the report, Trump was impressed by Ukraine's long-range drone and missile strikes and urged Zelensky to act more boldly towards Russia. Yeah, that's been reported in a number of media outlets. Trump hasn't said that publicly. What he said publicly is what we played earlier during his meeting with Rutte, where he seems to be saying, "Oh, Zelensky is doing well," but he hasn't said, "Well, that I support deep strikes inside Russia," which is certainly that is a high risk strategy, but not impossible. I mean, because as I say, Trump doesn't seem to be leading at all, so it may be that he's just going to allow this to happen, irrespective of the risks that the United States will be running through one of these deep strikes into Russia. Anyway, while this could be a pro-Ukraine spin, I believe it exposes what Trump has long tried to hide. Despite his carefully crafted image of neutrality, he's far more supportive of Zelensky and the EU than many realize, while Putin continues to buy into the illusion. Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. I think Trump, who, when he's running for office, seems willing to challenge the status quo, and he's hardly the first opportunistic politician to do that. So as long as you're not in office, you can be very bold and make all sorts of promises, and you show that you're thinking out of the box and that you're really going to challenge the military establishment, the media consensus, and so on. But once in power, Trump has shown himself to be extraordinarily cautious. And we saw that during his first term, when he promised to withdraw US troops. He never actually did so. He never withdrew from Afghanistan, never withdrew from Iraq, never withdrew from Syria. He never really went very far with the rapprochement with Russia. He just didn't do it. Just like on COVID, he just easily accepted the consensus. And so something like that, I mean, with Israel, Iran and Israel, Trump accepted the whole Netanyahu case, that somehow Iran will crumble. Experts told him that Iran won't crumble, but Trump, hey, I'm going to do this, and Iran will crumble. It didn't. So when it comes to Ukraine, it's he hasn't really done anything bold. And, then, yeah, he sort of opened up channels of communication, some negotiations with Russia. But when bold action was necessary, which came after the meeting between Lavrov and Rubio in Riyadh, and after Anchorage, when some boldness was needed, Trump couldn't do it. And he allowed others to steer him off course. And now he just doesn't seem at all interested. So does he support Zelensky? No, I don't think he particularly supports Zelensky. On the other hand, does he have the energy and vision to try to bring this to an end? No, he doesn't. So I think he's just going along with a consensus. Who's pushing this consensus? Just like with Iran, who pushed it? Israel pushed it. He went along with it. Who's pushing Ukraine? Well, there's obviously the military security establishment in the US, but above all, the NATO apparat. Above all of these European leaders whom he purports to despise, but whom he follows. So, Emmanuel, and he'll follow it. He'll be unhappy. He'll be complaining that they didn't support him on Iran, but ultimately, he will accept their diagnosis. So yeah, I agree with you, Cynthia. So thank you so much. And then Robert says, Robert, thank you very much. It's very, very good to see you. Thank you for your generosity. So Robert says, by way of useless Thursday, useless Thursday. evening erudition, I was surprised when Netflix got into production, but the idea is as old as the movies. In 1924, Lowe's Inc. acquired MGM to guarantee a steady stream of films for its theaters. Yeah, that's right. MGM produced The Wizard of Oz. Netflix is doing the same thing today with Stranger Things and The Crown. No, I think that's right. Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. They acquired the theaters and the films that went with the theaters, and that of course made a lot of sense. And that, that put an end to the independent theaters, and they were all basically controlled by these studio giants. So yeah, absolutely right. And then yeah, you're right. That's exactly what Netflix is doing. So yeah, I absolutely agree. And then Robert goes on, George, am I right in recalling you argue Israel bore responsibility for the 73 war? What do you see as President Richard Nixon's motivation for coming to Israel's aid? If he believed Israel had brought the crisis on itself, why did he authorize the massive U.S. airlift? Well, that's right. What I believe to be the case is that during Nixon's first term, Nixon and his Secretary of State, William Rogers, had been pushing Israel to make major concessions to the Arabs. And he thought that essentially it was very much doable because the Arabs had become after they were now chastened after the 67 defeat, and Nasser had become very reasonable. Nasser, of course, died in 1970, September 1970. He was replaced by Sadat, but Sadat showed himself very early on, even though I think the Americans still thought that he was aligned with the Soviet Union. But Sadat showed himself to be a very wily, cunning character. So Nixon and Rogers thought that here's an opportunity for Israel to make peace with its neighbors. At the time, really, not that much was demanded of Israel, other than the obviously withdrawal from the occupied territories, the territories occupied since 67, with obviously some security issues resolved, and an attempt to resolve the refugee problem. No one was talking about a Palestinian state. No one said we should have a state for the Palestinians, but there was the refugee problem. And those were enshrined in innumerable United Nations resolutions that Israel has to address the refugee problems that are caused by the 1948 war. Nixon and Rogers thought that this was very much doable, a kind of a land for peace plan. And of course, Israel, absolutely obdurate in refusing to do so. And I think when the Arabs struck in 73, that I think Nixon did think that this was that Israel had got its just desserts. It had refused America's entreaties to make some kind of a deal. It had refused all opportunities for some peaceful accommodation, and that's what was going to happen. The Arabs would basically seek to avenge the loss in 67. Now that's why I think Israel was seen to be responsible for the war by refusing to negotiate from 67 onwards, which is now, that was already 6 years. I mean, six years at the time seemed like, wow, this is such a, this has been going on and on. Israel is refusing to talk. But now it's sort of 60 years, so many years have gone by, and still Israel is refusing to make any concessions. But the rest of your question is, I think, makes it very difficult, which is, if he believed Israel had brought this crisis on itself, why did he authorize the massive U.S. airlift? Well, there I think he was thinking in Cold War terms. And I think Kissinger was probably influential in that. And because I think Rogers and Nixon had looked at the Middle East in much more conventional Republican terms, which was, well, there's a conflict here between the Jews and the Arabs over territory. We have good relations with Israel, but we also have good relations with the Arabs. We need to somehow keep our friends, our Israeli friends, and keep our Arab friends happy. That was, I think, much more of the sort of the Nixon-Rogers position. Kissinger saw it in Cold War terms. And I think Kissinger persuaded Nixon that if Israel goes down, if Israel is defeated, and I think that was they were really seriously concerned in the White House in 73 that Israel would be defeated. That if Israel is defeated, then this will be a huge, colossal defeat and humiliation for the United States, and a massive victory for the Soviet Union. That this will be a great geopolitical shift against the United States. I think Nixon was persuaded by that this would be interpreted as a defeat in the Cold War. Given the sort of mediocre American performance in Vietnam, if you add on top of that the loss of American credibility in the Middle East when Israel, the U.S. ally, goes down, and I think that's why they made that massive airlift, just because out of fear that Israel would be defeated. And then, of course, you have the next stage of it was the fear that the Soviet Union would introduce its own forces into the Middle East. I think it was always unrealistic, but nonetheless, that was the famous Nixon nuclear alert when he put all forces around the world, including nuclear forces that were involved in, I don't know, strategic air command, or it put everyone on alert because of the possibility that the Soviet Union was going to deploy its troops in the Middle East. The Soviet Union wasn't going to do that, but that was a huge headline at the time. Nixon orders a nuclear alert. But that was again the fear that this competition between the two superpowers could lead to a victory for the Soviet Union and a defeat for the United States. And particularly at the time when Nixon was kind of enfeebled because of Watergate. By October 1973, Nixon was already in quite serious difficulties over Watergate. This was already, the Saturday Night Massacre took place during the Yom Kippur War, so he was much weakened, and therefore there was a real fear within the White House that the Soviet Union would try to exploit Nixon's weakness in order to gain unilateral advantages against the United States. Had it not been for those factors, I think maybe Nixon would have sat on his hands. More than that, he wouldn't have ordered such a massive airlift for Israel. So I know. I think that would be my answer. So anyway, thank you, Robert. And then Robert says, speaking of Burnham, it's funny when you say Burnham. I always think of James Burnham. This is the kind of person that Robert normally would ask about. James Burnham, but now we're talking about Andy Burnham. Speaking of Burnham, in Three Stooges, 1936 film Disorder in the Court, the name of the defense counsel's firm was Dewey, Burnham and Howe. Well, I didn't know that. I have to say, I've never been a fan of the Three Stooges. It's just always been kind of a blank for me. I don't get the humor. I don't find any of that funny. I know a lot of people go for it, so I can't really contribute anything thoughtful on the subject of the Three Stooges. I mean, other sort of American comedic giants. I'm a huge fan of the Marx Brothers, obviously, W.C. Fields, but the Three Stooges, I just can't do it. Anyways, but anyway, thank you about the Three Stooges. Well, I think my time is up. I think we've talked along a great deal, and I really appreciate everybody being here with me this evening. Thank you so much for all of your questions and comments and observations. Somebody says here, George's favorite stooge is Curly. I, again, I just don't know enough really to be able to say anything on that. But anyway, thank you so much. We'll do some more podcasts over the weekend, and then we have the live stream next Monday with a joint live stream with Peter next Monday. Screening Monday. Excuse me. Somebody said maybe George doesn't like slapstick comedy. No. Quite on the contrary, I do like slapstick comedy. Huge fan of Benny Hill. I think Benny Hill is very funny, and I also am a huge fan of the Naked Gun movies and the whole Naked Gun shows. I think that's also kind of slapstick comedy, not intellectual at all, but I do think they're very funny. But so by no means do I like intellectual comedy. And the NKMRD says, why do British voters tolerate this farce? Cynthia, I think it's pure exhaustion at this point. Yeah, I think it's fair. But governments here spend a lot of taxpayer money on working against taxpayer opinion. Yep, absolutely. That's a very, very important point. And that's true about the EU and everything else. The government propaganda is now enormous. That's a huge, huge business. Overwhelms anything from the independent opinion makers can come up with. The logistics are not looking in favor of people resisting this fraud. Absolutely, media downplaying protests or reframing them does not help. Yeah, I agree with all of that. Yeah, so thank you for that, MKMRD. And so thank you for tonight. Thank you for those who contributed to the tip jar. I'm going to have to address the dogs tomorrow. It's never a pretty sight. It's always grim. But thank you for that anyway. I'm going to see you very soon. See you next Tuesday. All the best. Good night. Bye-bye.